In college, we had 3 sections. First section was taken by one Mr. Captain Balasubramaniam, second was one by Sankara Subramaniam, third was one by Gopalakrishnan. The Captain Balasubramaniam and Sankara Subramaniam, they are writing books on mathematics. They were excellent teachers, were very renowned teachers. The third section, when Gopalakrishnan was there, we call him Appa. He is a very
May I now request Srinivasan to kindly come and occupy the dais. Asked to give opinion, is ready to give alternatives, options, permutation, combination, etc., etc. When the same chartered accountant is asked to certify what he has opined, then it drills down to one single opinion or a conditional opinion or a opinion with ifs and buts. That is the way in which it comes to us, and that refinement is what is needed. And a person who has gone through as a student, as a chartered accountant, as a client, for the purpose of understanding the gift tax and capital gains, is one who practices as chartered accountant. But a person, it is opinion giving with reference to the client who is going to be the end user or the winner or the loser with reference to the opinion given. But when it comes to certification, it is a research a person has to do on that particular area, and that particular area of capital gains and gifts, in order to write a book and publish a book. And such is the research which has gone behind our speaker for the second session, CA N.S. Srinivasan, who has recently come out with a book on this capital gains, a practical guide to taxation of capital gains and gifts. When a person has done such a much research to bring out a book, we thought that he is the fit person to deal with capital gains, gifts as an income. That is the topic which we have chosen. And for this August audience, CA N.S. Srinivasan needs no introduction. Most of us know him otherwise, and this particular type of introduction I wanted to give because he has very recently authored and published a book titled A Practical Guide to Taxation of Capital Gains and Gifts. The essence of it, the substance of it is what is that we have to deliberate in the next 1.5 hours. And over to Srinivasan. Before he takes on the dais, let me request the chairman of SARC, CA K. Shanmugasundaram, to honor with a shawl. Thank you, sir.
Respected Chairman of SARC CAK Shanmugasundaram, my dear friend Mr. Aruloli, respected senior members of this profession who are seated here, and other friends, good evening to all of you. When Chairman requested me to speak on some topic, then I asked him what are the topics which are listed for this refresher course. Then he went on reading out. He said taxation of gifts as income is one of the topics. I readily agreed, because only recently I happened to apply my mind in a very detailed manner on this one particular section in Income Tax Act, and then I came across so many puzzles and conundrums in the small section. So I thought I will include it as one of the important topics in that book. Accordingly, I agreed. By way of introduction, what I will do, I will just tell you, those who are familiar with Tamil, they will be aware of one saying, Nayar Piditha Pulival. See, for some ulterior motive, the lawmakers brought the section 56(2)(6) initially, because they found that some of the politicians, they were trying to evade tax by treating so many amounts received as gifts from their party men and well-wishers. So they wanted to tax such items. That is why they brought section 56(2). But all of you will be aware, earlier Gift Tax Act was there, Gift Tax Act 1958 was there. Even though the revenue generated from that Gift Tax Act was not significant, it was acting as an anti-tax avoidance legislation. It was acting like a bulwark. People were not able to get away with that. There have been any number of case laws on gift tax. It was there in force. But by way of simplification, they removed the Gift Tax Act with effect from 1/10/1998. I am just giving you the legislative history, what happened so far. Then I think most of you will be aware, in between there was an aborted attempt to bring donor-based gift tax. After a lot of representations, that attempt was given up. Then only within a gap of 6 years, with effect from 1st July 2004, they brought section 56(2)(5). 1st October 2004, sorry. They brought section 56(2)(5), where they said any gifts of monies received in excess of rupees 25,000 will be deemed as income in the hands of the recipient. Friends, let me tell all of you that nowhere in section 56(2)(5) or 6 or 7 or 7A, whatever it is, they have used the word gift at all. Even though the attempt is to tax the gifts received as income, they have never used the word. They have only used the word sums received without consideration, or assets received, property, immovable property received without consideration, or assets received without consideration or inadequate consideration. These are the words used. But still, the effect is they are trying to tax the gifts received as income. That is why we have titled it like this. Then section 56(2)(5) was replaced by section 56(2)(6) with effect from 1/10/2006 by Taxation Laws Amendment Act 2006, where the only change made was to increase the monetary limit from rupees 25,000 to 50,000. But there was a significant change. See, earlier the 25,000 exemption was available for each gift. So you can receive any number of gifts in a year up to 25,000. As long as it did not exceed 25,000, there was no problem. After realizing this loophole, they plugged the loophole and made this amendment, and they said aggregate of all gifts received, if it exceeds 50,000, then it will be liable for tax. Then the whole amount will be liable for tax. Then the next step was they deleted, not deleted, 56(2)(6) is still there. With effect from 1/10/2009, they brought 56(2)(7). Here, as far as the cash gifts are concerned, the position is the same. But they also brought into the statute book tax incidence for gift of assets received. There also they have categorized it into two groups: assets in the form of immovable properties and other assets. Other assets, it's not applicable in case of all other assets, only few assets which they have listed. Thereafter, by Finance Act 2010, they brought section 56(2)(7)(a), which is an attempt to tax gift of shares of closely held companies in the hands of closely held companies and firms. then let me tell you, already section 68 is there to tax unexplained amounts which are found during survey or search or even during the course of the assessments. But section 68 deals with a situation where the credit is found in the books of accounts and the assessee is unable to offer proper explanation, or the explanation offered by the assessee is not satisfactory to the income tax officer. In such cases, section 68 will come into the play. If the assessee says it is only a loan credit and he could not prove it, then section 68 will come into the play. But where the assessee says it is a gift received, then 56 to 6 or 7 will get triggered. So this is the way in which these sections operate. Next. See, now the issue is it a tax or is it an income tax on gifts? Yes, it is an income tax on gifts. Even though they have not used the word gift, the effect is the same. Then, as I said earlier, see, inadequacy of consideration comes into the picture only in respect of assets other than immovable properties. It is not relevant in the case of cash gifts and immovable property. I will be explaining these aspects in a detailed manner little later. Now, I have just highlighted the scope of my presentation. Initially, I will be dealing with the terms individual, HUF, firm and closely held company, because these are the only assessees to whom this section applies. Then what are the exemptions available in respect of tax on gifts received? Then tax implications of gifts of money, tax implications of gifts of immovable property, tax implications of gifts of other assets in the hands of individuals in HUF, tax implications of gifts of shares of closely held companies in the hands of firms or closely held companies. Then what are the issues which are common to all these aspects? This is how I will structure my presentation. Next. Now, if you look at the overall scheme of tax on gifts, as I said, firms and closely held companies are taxable only in respect of gift of shares of other closely held companies received by them. Other than that, they are not liable for any other tax. Whereas, in the case of individuals and HUF, they are liable for tax on gifts of monies or all other assets received which are specified in this section. They are taxable only in the hands of individuals and HUFs. Next. Now I am taking up the definition of these terms. Now the term individual, you may be wondering why I should deal with this term at all, because those who have studied Income Tax Act, all of them will be quite familiar with this term individual. See, vis-a-vis a single person, there is no dispute at all. He is an individual. But to what extent this term individual can be used by the assessing officers to harass other entities? That is my concern. If I am wrong, you can correct me. See, my question is whether the term individual will include groups of individuals like BOIs, bodies of individuals, and trusts. Now you may be wondering why this dispute at all. If 7 or 8 people, they have been jointly assessed as BOI, whether that can be termed as an individual, and if that group receives any gift, can it be subjected to tax? That is the issue. I have given you 2 decisions, both of the Madras High Court. One is in the case of CIT versus Venu Suresh Sanjay Trust, 138 CTR, and another ITO versus Arihant Trust. See, in these 2 decisions, BOIs were held to be equivalent to individuals, but for different purposes. I have also indicated what for. In the case of CIT versus Venu Suresh Sanjay Trust, it was an issue under S12 section 80L. I think those who have been practicing for long years, you will be aware of section 80L, which was there in the statute book, which allowed deductions from the total income, gross total income, for interest income on bank deposits and dividends. In that case, the issue was a trust with only individuals as beneficiaries they claimed ATL exemption for dividend income on shares, which was denied. Then they put forward the plea that a trust is assessable in the same status as individual, because if you all see the scheme of taxation of trust, private trust I am talking, not charitable trust, which is given in section 160 and 161, what it says, the trustees are assessable in their representative capacity and their tax liability will be coextensive with that of the beneficiaries, which means their status will be the same as that of the beneficiaries, and also the tax liability will be the sum total of the incremental tax liability of the beneficiaries. That's all it says, which means if all the beneficiaries of the trust happen to be individuals, then the status of the trustees also will be that of the individual. That is, on this basis the Madras High Court held that the status of this trust is only individual, and the section has not precluded such entities from claiming ATL benefit, and they are entitled. Similarly, in section 194A, there is a requirement to recover TDS from interest payable on deposits and loans if it exceeds the threshold limit. But that is not applicable where the payer happens to be an individual who is not subject to tax audit. In that case, they had paid interest without recovering TDS. There also it is a private family trust. The department wanted to fasten TDS liability on them, and they put forward this plea. We are assessable in the status of individual, so we are exempt from section 194A requirement. It was accepted. So whether the IT authorities can use these precedents to tax gifts received by such entities as income, that is the issue. That is the question I have put forward. Now, according to me, it is not applicable. I have given some of the arguments. Of course, these are all only arguments. See, the statute, if you see section 56(2)(5) or 56(2)(6) or 56(2)(7, they refer only to individuals and HUF. You are also having AOPs, BOIs in the statute. It has not included them. So we can say that it is not applicable, but that is not a sound argument. The next very, very sound argument which we can canvass is that exemption for gifts from relatives is provided. See, when you say that gifts from relatives is exempt from tax, always you associate the term relative only with respect to an animate person, not with an entity. So on this basis, we can definitely argue with success that here what the statute contemplates is only individual per se and not groups of individuals. Moreover, we can always say that these decisions are of benevolent decisions which have been rendered in a different context, and they cannot be imputed into this section. Again, where some monies or properties are given to a trust with so many individuals as beneficiaries, when the trustees receive them, they are receiving it for discharge of certain obligations which are thrust upon them, which constitutes consideration. So you can't say that it is without consideration. So for all these reasons, you can very well say that this will apply only to specific individuals and not to groups of individuals. Then HUF. See, as you know, it applies to HUFs also. It is very important. Now, for understanding this provision, I have given the various situations in which an HUF status can arise for the purpose of tax assessment. See, when ancestral property is inherited, then it leads to HUF status after marriage, because a person can inherit ancestral property even before marriage. Until he gets married, the income as well as the assets of that ancestral property will be assessed in his individual status only. Once he gets married, then whatever is traceable to the ancestral property, it will be separately assessed as HUF status. Now, in what forms the inheritance can arise? It can be through survivorship or through partition or bequest. Survivorship, all of you will be knowing, assuming a father was there who was the karta of the HUF and he was having a son or one or two sons, then after the demise of the father, whatever ancestral property was there of which he was the karta, it devolves on the sons by virtue of survivorship. That is one instance. Then partition. Even when the father was there, he can partition the HUF either partially or by metes and bounds and give the property to the sons, in which case it will form part of the son's HUF, or it can be through bequest. A person can bequeath assets to the HUF of another person. That is possible. So that is also inheritance, because he gets it from the estate of the testator. So these are the modes in which HUF assessment can be done. Then HUF nucleus through gifts or settlement. This is a never-ending debate whether an HUF nucleus, because we cannot expect all persons to have ancestral property. See, the general principle under the Hindu law is every Hindu, previously we used to say males, now females are also given co-parcenary status, so I don't want to get into that aspect. Let us say every Hindu male, he acquires undivided family status immediately on marriage. It is immaterial whether the HUF has got ancestral property or not. But for tax purposes, whether we can create an HUF nucleus through gifts or settlement, yes, it is possible. I have given certain decisions. The various decisions of the Supreme Court and Madras High Court, I don't want to go into those decisions. Generally, the impression was that an HUF nucleus can be created through gift only from close relatives and family members. But I have also given one citation of the Supreme Court where the gift was made from a stranger and it was accepted for valid reasons. See, in all these cases, bona fide has to be established. Now you may wonder why I am shouting so much on this. The problem is when the HUF gets assets through inheritance, 56 to 6 or 7 is not attracted. But when it gets assets through gifts, problem will arise. If the gift amount exceeds 50,000, immediately it will be subjected to tax. So all of you will have to be extremely careful about this hereafter. That is why I have dealt with this in a detailed manner. Then firm. Firm, it is as defined in section 2 subsection 23 is nothing but as defined in Indian Partnership Act. And now the definition of firm includes LLPs also. It is provided in section 2 subsection 23. Then the question arises, if you see section 184, it prescribes certain conditions for assessment of a firm as a firm for tax purposes. The conditions are, first of all, there should be a partnership deed which contains the names of all the partners, and their share in profit or loss should have been clearly specified, and then a certified copy of the partnership deed should be delivered to the income tax officer at the time of first assessment. Of course, this provision was made when the paper returns were there, not now, whatever it is. Then whenever there is any change in the constitution, in that year also again a certified copy of the changed partnership deed should be delivered to the income tax officer. Now it also has one, previously there used to be one clause which says that if a firm does not comply with these requirements, it will be treated as an AOP. That provision has been taken away. But it contains one provision which says if the firm becomes subject to 144 assessment, then still it will be assessed as a firm, with the only difference is that deductions for partners' remuneration, interest on capital, all those things will not be allowed. But those things are not at all relevant. The moment it is treated as a firm for the purpose of assessment, then the jurisdiction of section 56 to 6 or 7 will get triggered, and we have to be careful about it. Then what are closely held companies? See, generally we have understood that these are non-PSI companies, that is companies in which public are not substantially interested. Mind you, if you see the definition of company in section 2 subsection 17, it also includes foreign companies. It uses the word bodies corporate which are incorporated outside India. So foreign companies are also subject to the jurisdiction of these two sections. Then one of the important conditions for being treated as a public substantially interested companies is that the shares, equity shares of this company should have been listed in a recognized stock exchange in India. Now the question is, there is a foreign company whose shares are listed in a foreign stock exchange, NASDAQ. Is it sufficient? New York Stock Exchange, NYSE. Is it sufficient? No, it will not help them. It only says recognized stock exchange in India. But if the foreign company, they have their securities listed in India, then they will escape the rigor of this tax. You may ask me whether it is possible. Recently it has happened. Standard Chartered Bank, they got their IDRs listed in Indian stock exchanges, then they will escape the rigors of this section. An Indian company which is not listed, so sum and substance, a closely held company is an Indian company which is not listed or which is not a wholly owned subsidiary of a listed company, as well as all foreign companies, they are closely held companies. Now, I will take up what are the exemptions from this gift tax which are available to individuals and HUFs. See, as I said earlier, under section 56(2)(5), exemptions for gifts of monies were available up to rupees 25,000 qua each gift. See, you may be wondering why we should be worried about this, because even now assessments will be pending for those years, because it was in force till 1/39/2006, assessment year 2007-8. There could be reopening cases. In those cases, they may ask you to prove the source for some of the credits in the bank accounts. In which case, if the amount of credit is less than 25,000, you can say that so and so gave me as a gift. Even if he is a stranger, you will escape the rigor of the tax. That's why I mentioned this. Then under section 56(2)(6), exemption for gifts of monies for aggregate sum of rupees 50,000. Then under section 56(2)(7), two exemptions are given. One exemption of rupees 50,000 for gifts of monies and another exemption of 50,000 for gift of assets. Two separate exemptions are available. Then what are the gifts which are totally exempt from this tax? Gifts from relatives. Then marriage gifts. I hope they will allow this marriage gift even for second marriages. Let us hope for that. Then gifts from institutions referred in section 10(20), all these charitable institutions. If any gifts are received from such institutions, they will be exempt. You will be aware, some people may receive an assistance of 1 lakh or 2 lakh for medical treatment from a charitable institution, then it will be exempt from tax. Then amounts received through will or bequest or in contemplation of death for both individual. See, the first three items of exemptions, they will be available only for individuals, like gifts from relatives, because they can be related only with individuals. Then marriage gifts, only an individual can get married. Then gifts from charitable institutions, whereas amounts or assets being received through will or bequest or in contemplation of death, they could be received both by individuals and HUF, and they will be exempt from tax. Then who are the relatives? Spouse, brother or sister. They have, fortunately, they have given a very, very broad definition of relatives. Maybe keeping the politicians in mind, I do not know. They have given a very wide definition of relatives. I have given the list of relatives. I don't want to repeat it. And for your benefit, I took the trouble of preparing a very big flow chart to see who are all the relatives who will be covered, and it is given at the end of my paper. You can go through it at leisure. Whenever you are caught in some problem, you can refer whether the chart will bail you out. Next. Now I will take up some of the issues which arise regarding availing of these exemptions. Now let me first take up receipt of monies or assets by nominees, especially shares. Now you would have seen in many bank deposits as well as company deposits or bank accounts, nominees would be mentioned. Assuming something happens to the account holder or the depositor and the nominee receives the money, whether there will be any tax incidence in the hands of the nominee. According to me, not. There is no tax incidence, because nominee does not receive by way of inheritance. He receives it on behalf of some other person. I will deal with shares slightly differently, but as far as all other assets are concerned, up to Supreme Court it has been clearly held that nominee receives the assets only in the fiduciary capacity. They have to hold it as such and then distribute it to the persons to whom they are meant. If the person from whose estate the money was received, if he has left behind a will, then the nominee has to distribute the money as per the dictates of the will. If no will was left behind, then the nominee will have to take the permission of the court, or he must ask the legal heirs or legal representatives to obtain a letter of administration and then distribute the assets in that manner. So as far as the nominee is concerned, they receive the assets or monies only in fiduciary capacity. So they cannot be visited with any tax consequence under section 5627 or 5626 or 7. Then let us take shares being received by nominees. I do not know how many of you would have read section 109A of Companies Act. What this section says, once a nomination has been registered in respect of shares of a company under section 109A, by complying with the procedure prescribed in the rules, then the nominees will acquire title to those shares absolutely and unconditionally, notwithstanding the provisions of any other statute, including Indian Succession Act. Because normally title passes from one person to another only by virtue of the provisions of Indian Succession Act. But this section 109A overrides all these legislations and says that the shareholder, the nominee, he becomes a shareholder and becomes entitled to those shares absolutely. Then the question arises, how section 5627 applies in that case. There also it will be exempt, because the nominee gets the shares by way of inheritance. Even if he gets the shares from a stranger and need not necessarily from a relative, it is only by way of inheritance, and so it will be exempt from tax. Then practical difficulties regarding gifts received for medical treatment. See, as I said earlier, if the gift is received from a recognized charitable institution, it is exempt. But what happens if it is received from strangers? I think all of you would have read very frequently newspapers, advertisements calling for financial help for medical treatment, and in such cases, benevolent donors will make substantial contributions to the afflicted persons and they receive these monies. Unfortunately, if they receive these monies directly into their bank account, this section will apply to them and they will be visited with tax consequence, which is a severe hardship. See, the lawmakers, they are making some law totally unmindful of the practical difficulties and hardship which would be caused to the subjects. That is the tragedy of this nation. For in such cases, what they have to do, before receiving these monies, they have to go and request the hospital whether they are administered by a charitable trust. And then they must ensure that it is routed through that charitable trust, and then it should be utilized for medical treatment. I don't know how they will be able to do it when they are already under stress. Then tax incidence for HUFs. As I said, the moment you receive some assets or gifts in excess of 50,000 rupees for an HUF, you are visited with tax consequence. Is it justified? Why should they do like this? Or let them fix some sizable amount, 5 lakhs or 10 lakhs. If it goes beyond that, you tax them. Then the next issue is, all of you will be aware of section 64(2). What it says, if an individual or any member of the HUF throws his self-acquired property into the common hotspot of the HUF, then the income from that HUF asset will be taxed in the hands of the transferor. That is what the section says. Now the issue is, if a member of the HUF throws his assets into the common hotspot of the HUF and whose value is more than 50,000, will it attract tax in the hands of the HUF? See, these are all the practical difficulties which are posed. Then only I have cited this decision of Supreme Court, Goli Iswaraya versus CGT. See, what this decision says, when any assets are transferred by a member to the HUF corpus, there is no gift at all. Section 64(2) is a fictional section. It deems that there is a transfer, and then it says that it is for the purpose of tax avoidance, and so it will be still taxed in the hands of the transferor. But that cannot be used to fasten the HUF with the tax liability, because Supreme Court decision clearly says that it is not a gift. The reason is, the logic is like this: when a person, once it becomes a HUF asset, no doubt, what was his absolute property has become a shared asset, because others also acquire title over it. But as far as the HUF, Hindu law is concerned, as far as the HUF assets are concerned, the members, they are holding the assets as joint tenants. See, an asset can be owned in two forms, either as tenants in common or as joint tenants. Tenants in common means some 3 or 4 persons are owning the asset with a specific share in that asset. Whereas joint tenants means all of them are owning it, but their individual shares are not known, not determined. That is the concept as far as Hindu law is concerned, because the extent of interest in the ancestral property keeps on varying through survivorship. That is the reason. Once it is established that the ownership is as joint tenants, you cannot predict what will be the value of the interest of the transferor member in the HUF corpus. He still has some interest over the transferred asset also. So you cannot strictly say that it is without consideration, and you cannot establish that it is for inadequate consideration. For your memory, I will just recall one decision of the Supreme Court in the N.S. Getty Chettiar case. It is under Gift Tax Act. In that decision, what the Supreme Court said, if the members of the HUF, they partition the assets, but the amounts allotted to the individual members are varying or disproportionate, it will not amount to gift. That is the decision. So you can't predict how much I will get at the time of partition. For these reasons, I am of the opinion, subject to contra opinion, that throwing the assets into the common archpart will not constitute gift or transfer for this purpose. Then comes settlement of assets on private family trusts. Whether it will be hit by this 56(2)(7) or 56(2)(6) or 7, whatever it is. Now, as far as private trusts are concerned, what happens? A trust deed is drafted. There is an author of the trust, 1 or 2 authors, and they hand over the monies or assets to trustees. For what purpose? They should administer the trust for the benefit of the persons named as beneficiaries in the trust deed, and for which all the detailed terms and conditions are specified. Now the issue is, when initially the assets are given to the trustees to be held as such, is there a gift? According to me, no. Because section 3 of the Indian Trust Act, it says, when assets are given to the trust, it is given for discharge of an obligation which constitutes valid consideration. So there is no, it is not hit by section 56(2)(6) or 7. All right. Whether at that moment, is there a transfer in favor of the beneficiaries? Now again, we have to go through the facts. See, the trust can be a specific trust or a discretionary trust. If it is a specific trust, means the share in the income and corpus of the assets is clearly defined. What each beneficiary will get is clearly defined. So can you say that each beneficiary has got a certain share of the assets given? No, necessarily not. Because when the money is given to the trustees, beneficiaries don't receive anything. What they receive is only beneficial interest under the trust. What is the beneficial interest? My right to share the income of the trust as defined in the trust deed, and also my right to share the corpus of the trust at the time of its determination. This is what is called beneficial interest. So what I am receiving is only beneficial interest under a trust. Okay. Whether this is taxable, fortunately, in the list of assets which are given in section 56(2)(7), beneficial interest under trust is not listed. So there itself we can escape the rigor of this section. Moreover, when the trust is created, the beneficiary does not receive any asset at all. Only when the trust gives some portion out of the income or corpus he receives. Only at that point we have to examine. Especially if it is a discretionary trust, the beneficiaries will not know whether they will receive any money at all, and even if they receive what they will receive, they will not know. So definitely they can escape the rigor of this taxation. Now let us come to the situation where assets are given to the beneficiaries, whether there will be any tax incidence. There we can clearly say that already I have been vested with rights under this trust. Only in lieu of that I am receiving this. So there is no gift or anything like that. That is why we can escape. Then another practical problem which is faced is gifts received from employer by ex-employee or his family members. See, an employee would have retired from service. Subsequently, he would have fallen sick, requiring huge expenditure on medical treatment. Then the benevolent employer may come forward to meet the cost of the medical treatment and give him 5 lakhs or 10 lakhs. Will it be hit by this? There, the opinion which I am taking is like this. If you see the definition of salary in section 15 as well as section 17(3), it says any amount received from ex-employer also is taxable as profits in lieu of salary. So it is taxable as salary in the hands of an ex-employee even if it is received from a former employer. It will not come under other sources. That we will have to tackle separately. But as far as the family members of the employees are concerned, strictly speaking, it will not be taxable in their hands as salary, because there is no employer-employee relationship between the giver and the receiver. Then what happens? Whether this will come into play? Yes. If one single family member receives this money, unfortunately, it will be subjected to tax. That is the tragic portion of this section. Then, now, no sir, it is received from the employer, sir. The relative question will not arise. Ex-employer, A Limited, they are the employers. Then Mr. B was working for them. He retires from service. Then he dies. His family is in distress. So A Limited, they give 10 lakhs to the family. They will be liable for tax. Then they will have to find some charitable institution to whom they should donate this amount, and then request the charitable institution to give the money to the family. You see, it's unnecessary trouble. Still, that is the law. No, they have to distribute it. But the amount is very small, sir, 50,000. See, nowadays medical treatment costs minimum 5 lakhs or 10 lakhs. If you go to Apollo Hospital, you won't come out without spending 5 lakhs or 10 lakhs. See, while you undergo the treatment, you should also be minding about section 56 to 6 or 7. All this nuisance, sir. Unwanted nuisance. So the employer should take the trouble of taking a legal opinion, and he should say that I am giving it to all these persons together, and so it is not liable to tax. See, already you are going in with a request for an obligation. You are going in with a request, begging bowl. Can you tell them, sir, it will, you club together all the family members and give it? See, these are all ridiculous. Then the issue is, all right, we claim certain gifts as exempt gifts. That is, gift was received from relatives or gift was received at the time of marriage. How to prove this? What documentation you should have? When you say that a relative has given the gift, then you should obtain at least a letter from him accompanied by your acceptance of the gift, and you should keep it. You see, in newspapers, as soon as this section came into force, so many articles were written and all of them said, no, you should obtain an affidavit from him and all that. See, between close relatives, why affidavits? If it has genuinely happened and you can prove it with reference to entries in the bank passbook or whatever it is, those affidavits may not be necessary. At least a letter should be there, exchange of letters. But what about marriage gifts? See, you may claim that I received 25 lakhs as marriage gift. How to prove it? At least you should have list of invitees, and also you should have videographs, the films or movies as they are doing, and you should capture everything on screen, and they should come and give big boxes even if they contain stones. It doesn't matter, you can say that silver articles were received, gold articles were received, and you should keep some record, and you can have some self-affidavit to prove all these things. See, these are all unwanted things. Then I am saying, despite observing all these precautions, you can't rule out the applicability of section 68. Supposing you say that you received a gift of 10 lakhs from a relative. You give a letter or affidavit, whatever it is. But the assessing officer is able to establish that this man could not have given this much of gift. He doesn't have the means to do that. Definitely he can invoke section 68. If this money is found credited in your books of account. I can go up to 8:30. Okay. But so what? No, Then exemptions which are available for firms and closely held companies. See, the exemptions are only few. Of course, one exemption I have left out, that also I will tell you. See, transfer of shares of a closely held company, closely held Indian company, in a scheme of amalgamation involving two foreign companies, which is covered by section 47(6)(a). What that section says, if there is a merger of two foreign companies, as a result of which the shares held by the amalgamating foreign company get transferred to the amalgamated foreign company, then it is not a transfer. But it prescribes certain conditions. The conditions are that at least post merger 25% of the shares of the amalgamated foreign company should be held by the shareholders of the amalgamating foreign company. That is condition number 1. The next condition is that the transaction should not be subjected to capital gains tax in the hands of the transferor foreign company in the country in which it is incorporated. It doesn't say that in the country in which it is resident. I don't want to get into that area, it's a highly controversial area. Only I am saying the law says it should not be subject to tax in the country in which it is incorporated. For instance, if you so arrange that the transferor company, that is amalgamating company, is incorporated in Mauritius, then it will escape the rigor of capital gains tax. So that is one instance. The another instance is transfer of shares of a closely held Indian company in the scheme of demerger involving two foreign companies, which is covered by section 47(6)(c). It is also more or less the same. That is, both the companies are foreign companies and the assets are transferred. Then the condition, the only difference is after the demerger, at least 75% of the shareholders of the demerged company should become shareholders of the resulting company. In the earlier case, it is 25%, here 75%. This is the only difference. Then transfer or issue of shares by resulting company in a scheme of demerger to the shareholders of demerged company in accordance with section 47(6)(d). See, even among Indian companies, demergers can happen, as a result of which assets of the demerged company will get transferred to resulting company. In consideration of that, resulting company will issue shares to the shareholders of the demerged company. This is also exempted. It is not hit by section 56(2)(7)(a), because if one of the shareholders of the demerged company happens to be a closely held company and they receive shares of the resulting company, which is also a closely held company, not hit, then section 47(7), what it says, in an amalgamation involving two Indian companies, if shares are issued by the amalgamated company to the shareholders of the amalgamating company, that also will be exempt. So that I have left out, you can include it. Next, transfer of shares between holding company and wholly owned subsidiary. See, this is the most problematic section. See, I have already listed out the exempt situations where gift tax under 56(2)(7)(a will not apply. But all of you will be aware that under section 47(4) and 5, if any assets are transferred between a holding company and its wholly owned subsidiary or vice versa, and the transferee company also continues to hold the asset as an asset and not converts into stock in trade, and the relationship is not broken for a period of 8 years, the transaction will be exempt from capital gains tax. I think all of you will be aware this provision has been there for ages. But unfortunately, that exemption is not carried through in section 56(2)(7)(a). So what happens as a result? If the holding company happens to be a closely held company and they transfer shares of another closely held company to its wholly owned subsidiary or even non-wholly owned subsidiary, which is also a closely held company, then 56(2)(7)(a) will be attracted. Now you may ask, what is the fun in it? Why should this happen? See, if I transfer it at a profit, then capital gains is exempted, no issues. So why should you bother? You can transfer it at a profit. No, I don't want to do it. I want to transfer it at book value. You may ask why. See, if I transfer it at a profit, no doubt I save on capital gains tax, but I will be liable for MAT, minimum alternate tax, because in MAT this transaction is not exempted between holding company and subsidiary company. To avoid MAT, I would like to transfer it at book value or less than the book value, whatever it is. So far there was no problem because I am not liable for capital gains tax. But here, this section 56(2)(7)(a), it will come into play and subject such transactions to gift tax. That is the effect. Now I have given, but here I want to argue on general principles, at least in respect of a 100% holding company and its subsidiary. See, when there is a transfer between these two entities, is there a gift? That is my question on basic principles. Because it is nothing but my alter ego. If you lift the corporate bill, as we have done in the case of Vodafone, then there is no transfer at all. Even assuming you want to return the corporate bill and say that it is a transfer, by transferring this asset, which you say is of a substantial value, then consequently the value of my shareholding in the subsidiary also goes up. So how can you say that it is for inadequate consideration? In this context, I have quoted the decision of the Calcutta High Court rendered under the Erstwhile Gift Tax Act, GTO versus Venesta Oils Limited. There it was the same fact. Assets were transferred from holding company to its wholly owned subsidiary, and department wanted to, and it was transferred at less than the market value. So they wanted to subject the transaction to deemed gift tax. Then the High Court said no. Between holding company and subsidiary, how can there be inadequacy of consideration? So it cannot be subjected to deemed gift tax. So can we invoke that principle and try to avoid the rigor of section 5627A? In this context, I have given 3 decisions which were all decided by the AIR. Only because of this decision 5627A came. In one decision, the shares were transferred at nil value. That is what I mentioned, the first decision. In the other 2 decisions, it was transferred at a profit, but still it was held to be not subject to tax because of 47(4). Then the department, the lawmakers, they found the decision eyesore, and so they plugged the loophole by bringing this section. Then I am taking up transfer of assets between partners and firm. See, in which situations it can happen. A partner transfers an asset to the firm as a capital contribution. This is dealt by section 45(3). 45(3) what it says, if any such assets are contributed to the firm, then you see what is the value of that asset which is credited to the account of the partner. Then that will be treated as the full value of consideration for the transaction, and the difference between that value and the cost of acquisition or index cost of acquisition will be liable to tax as capital gains. So far so good. Now the issue is assuming a share whose market value, it's a quoted company share, whose market value is 1 lakh rupees, or let us say 10 lakhs rupees. I am transferring 1000 shares whose market value is 10 lakhs rupees. But I am transferring it at 1 lakh rupees. So there is a difference of 9 lakhs. My cost is only 10,000. So on 90,000, I pay capital gains tax at 10% or whatever it is. No disputes. But the issue is whether the firm will be liable to tax under section 5627A for this 9 lakhs. See, if it is a quoted company share, there is no tax. Whereas if I transfer an unlisted company shares in the same manner, that is, a book value is 10 lakhs, transfer value is 1 lakh. Then for the difference between 10 lakhs and 1 lakh, firm will be liable to tax under section 5627A. That is the problem. Then whether it will affect distribution of assets pursuant to dissolution of the firm. Again 45(4) we have to see. 45(4) what it says, if a firm is dissolved and as a consequence assets of the firm are distributed to the partners, then the fair market value of the assets distributed as on the date of distribution will be deemed as consideration, and it will be subject to tax in the hands of the firm. Now the issue is in the hands of the partners when they receive these assets, whether there will be any tax incidence. You may ask me whether there can be any such. Yes, it can be, because the firm may be having shares, in even quoted shares the firm may be having. If they give those quoted shares to the partners in pursuance of dissolution, will it trigger the applicability of section 5627 in the hands of the partners? According to me, not, because already this transaction has been subjected to tax at fair market value as capital gain. So you can't subject the same transaction to double tax by taxing it once in the hands of the firm and again in the hands of the partners. That is how we have to argue it. But if you ask me whether the matter is free from doubt, no. Because the person assessing the partner and the person who assesses the firm, they will be different and they may take a different view. The problems cannot be totally ruled out. Then I will deal with what are the tax implications regarding gifts of monies. See, already I have explained what happens in the first provision, that is 25,000. Then again from 110/2006 to 39/2009 it was 50,000. I have explained. Now I will only deal with the term monies. It's a very common term. Why should we worry about it? The term money should include cash as well as bank balances. I don't want to get into the controversy of cash and cash equivalents created by the new Schedule 6. Just I am trying to be a common man, not as a company lawyer or whatever, lawmaker. So money will include cash and bank balances. Now the issue is whether it will include loans or receivables. According to me, not. They are a different asset class, and actionable claims, nowadays even actionable claims are transferable. You would have seen these actionable claims being securitized and sold and bought and all that. So it is a totally different asset class. It will not constitute monies or sums. Then what about fixed deposits with banks and companies? See, as far as the fixed deposit banks are concerned, whatever is remaining in the name of the depositor, it is his money. It is his asset. It can't be treated as a sum. Unless he forecloses the deposit, then it is credited to his bank account, in which case it becomes a sum. Otherwise, it is only a deposit. It is not sum. It cannot be assigned. As far as the deposit with companies are concerned, they are in the nature of the loans, which means they also don't constitute monies. Then next, tax implications in respect of gifts of immovable properties. See, here what section 56(2)(7) says, only if there is an absolute gift of an immovable property, 56(2)(7) will apply. Where it is transferred for some consideration, then section 50C will apply. That is what it is clear. Initially, the section was not properly drafted. Subsequently, they redrafted it and they made it very clear that 56(2)(7) will apply only when there is a total gift. So, when there is a total gift, you have to take the stamp duty value of the property gifted, and that will be taxable in the hands of the donee or settlee if it exceeds 50,000 rupees. Then you may ask me, what happens if there is a transfer for a consideration? Then as per section 50C, if the transfer value is less than the stamp duty value, then the stamp duty value will be deemed as the consideration and it will be subjected to capital gains tax. Now the issue is, what is an immovable property? Fortunately, they have given a specific definition of this term in section 56(2)(7) itself. There they said land or buildings or both. Now again, whether it will include rights over immovable properties, like leasehold rights, TDRs, transferable development rights, which is now gaining importance because of all these acquisition projects and all that. So whether TDRs, they will also be included. According to me, yes, because under the general law it has been held that the term immovable property will also include rights over immovable properties. Then what is stamp duty value? They have said it is as defined in section 50C. Now the question is, what happens if there is a dispute on stamp duty value? According to me, if a transaction happens between close relatives, at least in most of the states in our country, it may not involve any dispute in stamp duty because it is subjected to concessional stamp duty. Even in Tamil Nadu as well as Karnataka, you can pay a nominal stamp duty as well as registration charge and register the document of gift or settlement, whatever it is. But where the settlement of the property is made in favor of non-relatives or those relatives who are not close relatives as defined in the respective stamp acts, then it will be subjected to tax as conveyance, deed of conveyance, in which case it will be taxed with reference to the guideline values. Definitely disputes will arise regarding the stamp duty value. So what there they say, you go by section 50C2. what section 50C2 says, if the person, the assessee, he says before the assessing officer that the stamp duty value is exceeding the fair market value of the property, or if the stamp duty value is not disputed before any forum, then the assessing officer is bound to refer the valuation of this property to the DVO, district valuation officer, and wait for his report. Based on that only the assessment should be completed. See this, yes, department DVO, department valuation officer, but in Bill Tax Act is called DVO. That now the issue will arise whether the assessing officer is bound to refer this matter. It has been held at least by several tribunals that yes, it is mandatory, even though the section 50C2 says the word may. Still they said it is substantial right of the taxpayer, so you are bound to refer once a request has been made. And secondly, what happens if the DVO's report is not received before the due date for completion of the assessment? There also they said you complete the assessment by accepting this consideration offered, but you can revise it by way of rectificatory action under section 155(15). Provision is made. Whenever the DVO's report is received, based on that you can do it. They have cleared it. So there won't be any problem. So wherever there is a settlement of immovable property in favor of those relatives where it is not subject to concessional stamp duty, or in favor of non-relatives, definitely all these rigors will apply. Then even if you transfer the property as a gift through power of attorney, then also it will be attracted. The amendment has been made. Then I am raising issue whether the term immovable property will include property anywhere in the world. Yes, the section does not restrict it to only properties in India. Now FEMA regulations permit people to hold properties abroad also, immovable properties. So if an Indian resident is settled with a property in UK, London, by one of his relatives, but who is not covered by this relative definition, yes, it will be attracted. Then gift of assets other than immovable properties received by individuals or HUFs, because companies I have already dealt with. This includes, you see here, it includes only these assets: shares and securities, jewelry.